Well, Ray, the theme for tonight's event is creating the new inspired by the past. What does that mean to you?
It is spending a lot of time listening to old buildings. You've got to listen carefully to old buildings. And they have a lot to tell you because they're great stories. Old buildings are all great stories. They're cultural stories, but they're architectural stories and can be employed to create something that's really new and fresh.
Ray, you worked most closely of all of us with both Charles and Paul. Would you want to talk about that?
They were very different characters. Charles was an artist at heart. He was a painter at heart. He approached things in a painterly, in a more emotional manner. And with a family history with architecture, grandfather and great-grandfather and father. So he had this body of knowledge, but he felt the urge to use it in a more abstract way. Paul came out of law and he approached things in a much more cerebral fashion, abstractly. He wanted to understand the mechanisms on how things work. So Charles was over here and Paul was over here. And I mean, as you guys know, I spent a lot of the time bouncing between them in lots of different ways because I was often the one who was drawing these things.
And Paul wrote the book Additions to Historic Buildings, which was the first time that anybody had treated an addition to a historic building as a distinct building type.
And some of our work sort of follows that textbook thinking, like Poly Prep, the addition that we did there.
It was a great opportunity. The Poly Prep occupied a 1890s double townhouse called the Hulbert Mansions on Park Slope. They were really scraping by to operate a school in these buildings. But they had a vacant lot next to them, and we had the opportunity to expand the school into the vacant lot. But it was also an opportunity to go back into the building itself and start to alter the DNA of the original Hulbert Mansions in order to make it work as a school. The connection of new and old, I think, resulted in essentially a seamless building that has, as I say, this wonderful continuum between 19th century architecture and, as we finished it in 2000, I'd say 21st century architecture.
And that's the wonderful part of working with old buildings because it leads to something that is deriving from the old building, but it's new.
And would you want to say something about the room that we're in? Speaking of preservation.
Well, this might be sort of characterized as a pure preservation project. It actually isn't, because we've actually done some sort of subtle and maybe not so subtle things to make this room usable for the 21st century. One of the changes that was made to the original chandelier is the insertion of a glass disc that's lit by LEDs. So it's a modern interpretation of the original.
What an opportunity to work on this building. Just unbelievable. We'd have to think it's probably the most important preservation project in the country.
It's been really a privilege to be able to work in this building.
I personally really love these additions to historic buildings because it's a way of bringing an old building into contemporary use and benefiting from the patina and layering and subtlety of the old and giving it a little of the energy of the new. One of the buildings that the firm did that I think expresses that is Saginaw.
We thought, how do we anchor this gem in the landscape? You won't do it by just making an addition in the front or the back. You do it by delicately attaching to this building and flanking it and flanking the garden. And as a result, you take this building that was just a diamond in the rough on the side of the road and you put it in a setting and you captured it with flanking buildings so that the result is just you've now created an institution rather than a house used as a museum.
Paul was a trustee of Greenwood, and that put him in a unique position of getting first in line for commissions to design at Greenwood. And you want to talk about what it was like to actually do the work?
They had decided that they wanted to restore the entrance gate, which had not been touched since the 1960s. And so we were challenged mostly to stabilize the building. And we put some structure behind the gables and we rehung the bell, but we brought the brownstone back to a semblance of its original appearance. And that was the first time the brownstone had been seen on that building in 50 years. After we had done this, and we did some restoration of the Warren and Wetmore Chapel as well, Greenwood had been working on the completion of a series of mausoleum buildings.
To go back to the question about working with Charles and working with Paul, Paul was absolutely convinced that that the generative form of that design come from the specific iconography of the cemetery. And so it was going to be a slab, and the slab for this was going to be a block of granite, and that 3 blocks of granite cut into the hill. And then in the middle, we designed this wonderful cascading glass curtain wall that came down, which was really inviting. And then at the top, these very austere pyramids, which are all throughout the cemetery. It's a very austere understanding of the pieces, but you put them together and you introduce the glass, and it creates something that's incredibly inviting, but incredibly part of the architecture of the cemetery. Paul was determined to use these components, and we did, I think, in a very successful way. Our buildings, I hope, are not one-liners. I think they take a while to read. They're slower reading, but it's always the inspiration from context, but looking at it in a fresh way.